A single draft ox standing in a muddy field in rural England can lean into a wooden yoke and drag a load weighing 4,500 kilograms across soft, uneven ground. That is roughly the combined physical mass of two full-size pickup trucks, chained bumper to bumper. Under those exact same environmental conditions, almost no domestic horse breed on Earth can match that raw output. In terms of grinding, earth-moving torque, cattle are among the most formidable domesticated animals that have ever walked beside human beings. So, how did the weaker animal become the creature that carried mounted warriors across continents, built sprawling empires from Hungary to Korea, and reshaped the entire operational speed of human civilization itself? The answer begins not on an ancient battlefield or a modern farm, but 54 million years deep in the vertebrate fossil record, and the exact same anatomy that gives cattle their extraordinary pulling power is precisely the skeletal architecture that makes them virtually impossible to ride at speed. That profound irony only becomes visible when you trace both species backward through deep evolutionary time to the ancient fork that split their lineages apart, sending each animal hurtling toward a completely different body plan, a completely different brain, and a completely different relationship with the humans who would eventually attempt to climb onto their backs. In 1876, paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh at Yale University described an extraordinary fossil specimen recovered from Eocene-era sedimentary formations in the Wind River Basin of Wyoming. The creature was small, standing barely 35 centimeters at the shoulder, scarcely tall enough to reach the knee of a modern human adult. It possessed 4 functional toes on each front foot, 3 on each hind foot, and small, low-crowned teeth adapted for browsing soft leaves in dense, humid, subtropical jungle. Marsh named the creature Eohippus, the dawn horse. It looked nothing like a modern horse. It looked far more like an agile, leggy rodent with delicate miniature hooves. If you had encountered Eohippus 54 million years ago in the dense rainforest that blanketed North America from Wyoming to Florida, you would never have guessed that its distant descendants would one day carry Mongol cavalry across the vast breadth of Asia. But from that tiny multi-toed forest browser, every single horse, donkey, and zebra on planet Earth today directly descends. Bruce McFadden, a vertebrate paleontologist at the Florida Museum of Natural History, spent decades reconstructing the evolutionary sequence that transformed Eohippus into the modern equine. His landmark 1992 work, Fossil Horses, tracked the morphological transitions generation by generation through one of the most complete fossil records known to evolutionary science. The story that emerges is one of relentless anatomical adaptation to an ecosystem that was rapidly vanishing beneath the animal's feet. Around 20 million years ago, during the Miocene epoch, the global climate cooled and dried dramatically. The vast subtropical canopy that had sheltered the dawn horse lineage for tens of millions of years began to thin and retreat. In its place, open grasslands expanded across the continent, forming enormous windswept savannas stretching to the horizon with virtually no tree cover. For the ancestors of modern horses, this environmental shift was an existential crisis. The forest canopy that provided camouflage was gone, and on open, flat grassland, there is nowhere to hide when a predator spots you. The equines that survived were the individuals that could run. Natural selection, operating across millions of generations on the prehistoric plains of North America, rebuilt the equine body into a specialized biological machine optimized for sustained aerobic speed over open ground. The multiple splayed toes consolidated into a single, hardened central hoof that functioned like an organic spring, storing massive kinetic energy during the compression phase of each stride and releasing it during push-off. The lower limbs lengthened dramatically, increasing reach and stride velocity. The body scaled up from 25 kilograms to over 500 kilograms. The barrel-shaped rib cage expanded to house enormous lungs capable of continuous aerobic output, supported by a cardiovascular system that could pump 30 liters of blood per minute at rest and surge past 250 liters per minute during a flat-out gallop. And then there was the spine. The equine thoracic vertebrae developed tall, blade-like dorsal spinous processes, particularly prominent from the 5th through the 9th vertebrae. These upright bony projections create a pronounced structural ridge between the shoulder blades that rises higher than any other point along the animal's back. Equestrians and veterinarians call this landmark the withers. The withers did not evolve to accommodate a human saddle. They evolved as a massive mechanical anchor point for the heavy nuchal ligament and the trapezius muscles that support the horse's heavy head during high-speed locomotion. When a horse gallops, its skull swings rhythmically down and forward with every stride, acting as a dynamic kinetic counterbalance. Without massive muscle attachments at the withers, the weight of the head would lever the animal face first into the dirt. The tall spinous processes at the withers solved that mechanical problem with absolute elegance. But in doing so, they created an extraordinary evolutionary byproduct, a natural structural saddle seat. A human sitting immediately behind the withers of a horse is resting in the most mechanically stable location on the entire animal, situated directly above the center of mass, locked into place by the horse's own skeletal geometry, which prevents a load from sliding forward over the shoulders or slipping backward over the hips. Nobody designed the horse for human riding. 54 million years of outrunning predators across open grasslands produced an animal whose skeletal architecture accommodated a human mount, as though it had been engineered to specification. The riding problem was solved tens of millions of years before a human being existed to know there was a problem to solve. The ancestors of modern cattle took an entirely different evolutionary path, and the body it produced is the reason you have never witnessed a heavy cavalry charge on cowback. The wild ancestor of all domestic cattle was the aurochs, Bos primigenius, one of the most imposing megafaunal herbivores to inhabit Eurasia during the Pleistocene. A mature aurochs bull stood up to 180 centimeters at the shoulder, roughly 6 feet tall, meaning its spine rested directly at eye level for an adult human standing beside it. It weighed upwards of 1,000 kilograms, roughly the mass of a compact passenger vehicle, brandishing forward curving horns that spanned more than 80 centimeters from tip to tip. The final wild aurochs on Earth died in the Jaktora forest of Poland in 1627. Julius Caesar, encountering them in the ancient forests of Gaul during his military campaigns in the 1st century before the Common Era, described them in De Bello Gallico as massive beasts possessing immense speed and ferocious power, sparing neither man nor animal they caught sight of. The selective pressures that forged the aurochs were fundamentally different from those that shaped the grassland horse. Where horses evolved on vast treeless savannas where survival meant outrunning every pursuer, the aurochs evolved along dense forest edges, woodland clearings, and river valleys across Eurasia and North Africa. Broken forest terrain did not reward high-speed sprinting. It rewarded dense bone density, raw muscle mass, and the ability to hold ground and fight. A charging aurochs did not need to outrun a pack of wolves or a cave lion. It needed to crush them, either by being too colossal to pull down or too lethal to approach. This divergence created two fundamentally incompatible skeletal structures. The bovine spine is broad, horizontal, and flat. The dorsal spinous processes on the thoracic vertebrae are short, providing no prominent withers ridge. The back is extraordinarily wide. While a broad back might sound comfortable, it creates a severe biomechanical failure for a human rider. A person sitting on a wide bovine spine must splay their legs outward at an extreme unnatural angle, completely losing the adductor grip that comes from pressing the inner thighs against a narrow equine barrel. On a horse, the rider's legs hang naturally and can clamp with significant force. On a cow, the rider sits in an involuntary split, balanced precariously on a flat platform with no skeletal ridge to prevent sliding in any direction the moment the animal shifts its weight. If you are finding this breakdown valuable and you want to understand the deep evolutionary mechanics behind the animals and systems that shaped civilization, subscribe right now. This channel breaks down structural investigations like this every single week. What happens when a bovine accelerates with weight on its back reveals why the riding comparison collapses entirely. In 2003, locomotion researcher Sandra Nouvel-Liertz at the University of Antwerp published detailed biomechanical kinematic analyses of bovine locomotion that quantified what traditional herdsmen had understood instinctively for millennia. Cattle are laterally unstable at speed. When a horse shifts from a walk to a trot, canter, and gallop, each gait is biomechanically distinct, operating on a predictable, symmetrical footfall sequence and oscillation rhythm. The equine center of mass remains stabilized over the base of support. During the suspension phase of the gallop, when all four hooves are momentarily airborne, there is a fraction of a second of near weightlessness that a trained equestrian can absorb and flow with. The motion possesses a rhythmic cadence that the human vestibular system can anticipate and synchronize with. Cattle do not produce that rhythmic cadence. When a cow accelerates into a run, its body rolls violently from side to side with every single stride. The wide bovine pelvis and divergent limb geometry create a heavy lateral swaying motion that actively fights against any load resting on its back. The center of mass shifts unpredictably between the left and right flanks. The experience is not riding. It is trying to maintain balance on a capsizing boat that lurches in a new direction with every footfall. The foot anatomy explains a major portion of this dynamic. Cattle are artiodactyls, meaning they walk on two weight-bearing cloven toes per foot. The split hoof divides ground impact into two separate contact points. At a slow walking pace, this arrangement is advantageous, spreading ground pressure across a wider surface area to navigate soft mud and marshland without sinking. But at a run, the split footfall introduces a micro-wobble at every impact that the horse's single solid parasodactyl hoof never produces. Every stride a horse takes concentrates force through a single solid hoof like a piston, driving directly into the earth. Every stride a cow takes divides that force between two independent toes, creating an unstable balance negotiation that compounds as speed increases. Yet even if you could somehow resolve the spine, the wide barrel, the rolling gait, and the cloven hoof, you would still hit the single physiological barrier that veterinary scientists consider the absolute disqualifier in the question of riding cattle. Horses sweat profusely. Cattle, for all practical purposes, do not. A working horse engaged in intense physical exertion can produce between 10 and 15 liters of sweat per hour. That is roughly 3 to 4 gallons of fluid, enough to fill a large bucket every 60 minutes. The sweat coats the skin surface and evaporates, rapidly pulling metabolic heat away from the core and maintaining safe internal temperatures even under prolonged exertion. The equine sweating mechanism is among the most sophisticated thermoregulatory systems in the entire mammalian world. Horses possess a dense network of apocrine sweat glands across their entire body that secrete a watery fluid rich in latherin, a powerful surfactant protein. Latherin reduces the surface tension of sweat, causing it to spread into an ultra-thin continuous film across the oily coat rather than beating up and dripping uselessly to the ground. That white foam you see on a working horse's neck is latherin maximizing the evaporative cooling surface across every square inch of skin. Cattle possess significantly fewer functional sweat glands. In European tauron cattle, sweat output is a tiny fraction of equine capacity. Zebu cattle, the humped breeds of tropical South Asia, possess slightly higher glandular density, but even the most heat-adapted cattle breed on Earth cannot approach the cooling output of an average horse. David Robertshaw, a legendary veterinary physiologist who dedicated decades to comparative thermal regulation in domestic livestock, documented this disparity across extensive clinical trials. When cattle overheat, their primary physiological cooling mechanism is not sweating. It is heavy respiratory panting. They attempt to dump metabolic heat through evaporation in the nasal passages and upper airways. This mechanism functions adequately when an animal is standing stationary in the shade on a warm afternoon. It fails catastrophically when the animal is carrying weight and moving at sustained speed, because the intense muscular work of locomotion generates internal metabolic heat far faster than shallow panting can vent it. A 500-kilogram horse carrying a 90-kilogram rider at a sustained trot generates enormous metabolic heat, but its latherin sweating system exports that thermal load rapidly, maintaining core temperature below 40 degrees Celsius for hours on end. The exact same scenario with a 500-kilogram cow produces identical internal heat, but the bovine respiratory system can dissipate only a small fraction of the load. Within 20 to 30 minutes of sustained locomotion in warm weather, the cow's internal temperature surges past safe physiological limits and enters clinical hyperthermia, progressing through rapid panting, thick drooling, uncoordinated stumbling, and fatal cardiovascular collapse. A 2018 study conducted at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln estimated that heat stress costs the United States cattle industry alone approximately $370 million annually in mortality, decreased milk yields, and impaired fertility, and that figure applies to cattle simply standing idle in pastures during summer heat. A horse can carry a human rider 50 kilometers in a single day, roughly 30 miles, and be fully prepared to repeat the journey the following morning. A cow forced to carry that same load over the same distance under a summer sun would collapse from systemic heat stroke before reaching the halfway mark. The thermoregulatory gap between equines and bovines is not a marginal difference that training or conditioning could ever close. The horse is an evaporative radiator on legs engineered to dump heat while running. The cow is an insulated furnace with no exhaust engineered to generate low-speed torque while standing still. If this kind of deep structural analysis is shifting how you understand history and biology, hit subscribe before you forget. The algorithm only delivers these long-form investigations to viewers who actively engage with the content. This physiological gap was compounded by behavioral psychology and herd social structure. Temple Grandin, the renowned animal behaviorist at Colorado State University, whose work transformed modern livestock handling, has written extensively about the fundamental divergence in how horses and cattle process perceived threats. Horses are obligate flight animals. When an equine perceives sudden danger, its primary deepest evolutionary instinct is to bolt at maximum velocity in the opposite direction. While an intense flight response sounds like an obstacle to domestication, it is the exact trait that makes horses steerable mounts once initial fear is managed. An animal driven to run can be channeled, apply leg pressure, and the horse moves forward away from the stimulus. Shift weight and the horse alters trajectory. Pull the reins and the horse yields to pressure. The entire discipline of horsemanship across 5,000 years is built on converting equine flight energy into controlled directional motion. Cattle do not respond with predictable flight. When a bovine perceives a threat, its reaction tilts heavily toward fight or freeze. Many cattle breeds, retaining the combative genetics of their aurochs ancestry, will lower their heads, plant their hooves, and charge directly at the source of pressure. An animal that is just as likely to spin around and gore the handler as it is to move away is an animal that cannot be reliably directed from its back. A mounted rider requires predictable forward propulsion. With cattle, applying directional pressure might produce forward movement, a sudden refusal to budge, or a violent lateral spin to confront the rider. Grandin also identified a critical difference in social cognition. Wild horse bands organize around a dominant lead mare who determines the route, speed, and timing of travel for the entire group. Individual horses are neurologically hardwired to follow this directional authority. When a human rider mounts a horse and applies consistent pressure cues, the equine brain maps the human directly into that vacant lead mare slot. The human commands direction, and the horse obeys because its neural architecture already contains the template for directional leadership. Cattle herds possess social hierarchies, but they are structured around feeding dominance, spatial spacing, and resource access rather than a single directional leader. Cattle are gregarious and seek safety in proximity, but they do not follow individual movement commands the way equines follow a matriarch. Training a horse builds upon pre-existing neural wiring. Training a cow fights against it. The bovine brain contains no vacant leader slot waiting for a human with reins. To a cow, a rider is simply an inexplicable, uninvited weight resting on its spine. This division determined the entire timeline of human domestication. Geneticist Daniel Bradley at Trinity College Dublin demonstrated through mitochondrial DNA sequencing that all modern tauran cattle descend from a founding population of as few as 80 wild aurochs cows captured in the northern Fertile Crescent approximately 10,500 years ago. 80 animals. From that tiny genetic bottleneck in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, every Angus, Holstein, Hereford, and Charolais on Earth today descends. Early agrarian societies domesticated cattle to solve problems that had nothing to do with speed or riding. Cattle provided dense meat, thick hide for leather, tallow for waterproofing, and following the prehistoric mutation for adult lactose persistence, a continuous supply of dairy that did not require slaughtering the animal. Above all, their immense pulling force made them the biological engines of ancient agriculture. Oxen broke dense clay soils that human muscles could never plow, hauled quarried limestone blocks for monuments, and turned grinding mills. Cattle were domesticated as stationary torque machines that converted rough scrub into labor calories and milk. Nobody needed them to gallop. The horse entered human domestication roughly 5,000 years later, and for an entirely different civilizational purpose. In 2009, archaeologist Alan Outram at the University of Exeter published landmark findings in Science demonstrating the earliest confirmed evidence of horse domestication among the Botai culture of northern Kazakhstan. dating to approximately 3500 before the Common Era. Microscopic analysis of horse mandibles revealed distinct bit wear on the second premolar teeth, direct proof that bow-tie horsemen were utilizing bridles and reins to ride across the Eurasian steppe. The Eurasian steppe forms a continuous sea of grassland stretching 8,000 kilometers from the plains of Hungary to the forests of Manchuria, roughly twice the width of the continental United States. Crossing that immense territory on foot was a brutal, multi-month expedition. On horseback, the journey could be completed in weeks. This single capability revolutionized human history. But a 2018 genomic study led by molecular archaeologist Ludovic Orlando revealed a fascinating twist. The bow-tie horses were not the ancestors of modern domestic horses. They were the ancestors of Przewalski's horse, the wild equines of Mongolia. Modern domestic horses descend from a completely separate lineage, domesticated on the Pontic-Caspian steppe in modern Russia and Ukraine around 2200 before the Common Era. That Western steppe lineage was the genetic lottery that spread across every continent, carrying every cavalry, drawing every chariot, and redrawing the political borders of the ancient world. The difference in speed between these two animals dictated the maximum geographical size of human empires. Before the horse, overland communication moved at the pace of a human runner, roughly 10 to 15 kilometers per hour, or an ox-drawn cart at 3 to 4 kilometers per hour. A full day of travel behind a yoke of oxen covered barely 25 kilometers. Mounted equines tripled that velocity overnight. The Mongol Yam Postal Relay Network, established across Central Asia in the 13th century, maintained stations spaced 40 kilometers apart, allowing royal dispatches to travel 300 kilometers in a single day, sustaining that pace across thousands of kilometers. The Persian Royal Road under Darius the Great stretched 2,700 kilometers from Sardis to Susa. Herodotus recorded that mounted couriers traversed the distance in 7 days, a journey requiring 3 months on foot. An empire can govern only as far as communication can reach before rebellions spread or tax revenues are stolen. The Roman Empire stretched 4,000 kilometers from northern Britain to Mesopotamia. Its administrative survival depended on the cursus publicus, a relay network of mounted horse couriers that carried imperial dispatches across the empire in 2 weeks. Replace those horses with draft oxen and transit time triples to 6 weeks. A regional revolt that could have been crushed in 30 days burns for an entire season. The empire fractures simply because the speed of governance cannot hold the territory together. Every historical border on an ancient map was drawn at the maximum distance a horse could reach in time to make governing functional. When Spanish conquistadors reintroduced horses to the Americas in the 16th century, ending a 10,000-year absence following the Pleistocene extinctions, the tactical asymmetry was absolute. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519 with 16 horses. Francisco Pizarro entered Peru with 27. The psychological and tactical dominance of mounted shock cavalry against infantry that had never encountered a riding mount dismantled empires. When horses escaped into the North American Great Plains, indigenous nations like the Comanche rebuilt their entire culture around equestrian warfare, becoming the finest light cavalry in the world. Massive herds of longhorn cattle roamed the same southern plains, yet no Comanche warrior ever mounted an ox for hunting or battle. The horse provided explosive acceleration, split-second directional maneuvering, and sustained stamina under the blazing sun that cattle could never offer. The few historical exceptions where cattle were ridden only served to prove the rule. In Southeast Asia, water buffalo have carried riders across flooded rice paddies for centuries, but they do so submerged belly deep in water, using the surrounding mud to dissipate metabolic heat and avoiding the hyperthermia trap. In the Himalayas, Tibetan herders ride yaks across freezing mountain passes above 3,000 meters, where ambient temperatures remain below 15 degrees Celsius and overheating is impossible. In East Africa, pastoralists ride Ankole Watusi cattle exclusively for slow, short ceremonial processions. In every case, cattle are ridden only when environmental cooling neutralizes their physiological limits. Under conditions requiring sustained speed and distance under warm skies, cattle collapse where horses thrive. Could selective breeding have bridged this gap over 10,000 years? Humans bred wild aurochs into dairy Holsteins, producing over 10,000 liters of milk annually, and transformed wolves into Chihuahuas. Why not breed a rideable cow? Because the necessary changes are deep anatomical constraints woven into the bovine body plan by tens of millions of years of divergent evolution. Narrowing the back would compromise the wide pelvis cattle require for calving. Lengthening the legs for speed would destroy the low center of gravity and massive shoulder musculature that make cattle exceptional draft animals. Redesigning the sweat gland density would require rewriting multigenic skin architecture that no breeding program has ever accomplished. And altering the cloven hoof would require mutating the foundational limb development of the entire order Artiodactyla. To breed a rideable cow, you would have to breed a horse. For thousands of years, humans could not even utilize horses for heavy draft pulling because primitive throat and girth harnesses pressed directly against the equine trachea and jugular veins, choking the horse if it pulled with maximum force. Oxen, carrying rigid wooden yokes across their massive broad shoulders, dominated heavy agricultural plowing. It was not until the invention of the rigid padded horse collar in China during the 5th century, arriving in Europe by the 9th century, that horses could pull heavy loads without strangulation. As historian Jean Gimpel argued in his 1976 work, The Medieval Machine, the horse collar transformed European agriculture, allowing horses to plow fields at twice the walking speed of oxen. And the horse collar worked because of the same anatomy that makes horses rideable, the prominent withers and solid thoracic spine that anchor a rider also anchored the padded collar. Every horse grazing in a pasture today carries a body refined by 54 million years of sprinting across prehistoric grasslands that no longer exist, escaping predators that vanished before human beings walked upright. Every cow standing in the neighboring pasture carries a body optimized for mass, power, digestion of rough forage, and survival through standing firm. We did not choose the horse for riding because ancient civilizations were cleverer than those that tried cattle. We chose the horse because natural selection had already completed the engineering project tens of millions of years before humans realized they needed a way to outrun the horizon. The real question that stays with you is what other evolutionary masterpieces are sitting in plain sight, perfectly adapted to purposes human civilization has not yet thought to test. Because the horse stood on the plains for millions of years before a human being looked at the ridge between its shoulder blades and recognized it not just as an animal, but as a vehicle, a weapon, and an accelerator of human history. If you made it to the end, you are here for the deep reality beneath the surface. Subscribe now, click the video on screen, and I will see you in the next investigation.